Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Thank you for being understanding. Let's see. Do, 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 do. All right. So, my name is Erica Nelson, and I am the co-director of the Humanitarian Geoanalytics and Signal programs at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. Today, I'll be presenting a spatial analysis of the displacement tracking matrix data collected and provided by the IOM. And we're going to be specifically looking at the intersection between climate and migration today in the Eastern Horn of Africa between 2018 and 2020. So we at HHI believe that this work is deeply relevant to understanding the intersection between climate and migration. We'll talk a little bit about how conflict interdigitates there, and ultimately want to evidence multiple ways in which various data streams can be integrated into a spatial analytical model to support humanitarian, programmatic, and policy decision-making. My obligatory outline in this presentation, I will be walking you through this study. We'll talk a little bit about the objectives, explaining some of the methods, the outcomes, and then engaging in a brief discussion. So as you know, the drivers of human displacement are becoming more and more complex. They range from conflict, poverty, emergent pandemics, to the increasingly pertinent variables of heightened mobility, social media influences, and climate change. The Eastern Horn of Africa in particular really epitomizes this reality. As of the 2022 IOM report, which was released earlier this year, the region hosts about 4.7 million migrant workers and 22.3 million displaced persons, which includes about 16.9 million IDPs, internally displaced persons, and 5.4 million refugees and asylum seekers. These levels of displacement due to conflict and disasters continue to climb. The region's dependence on rain-fed agriculture and pastoralism means that livelihoods and food security are inextricably linked and affected by long-term environmental changes and natural hazards. And as we all know, the Eastern Horn of Africa remains a region that's marked by persistent conflicts and state instability, as is evidenced by the recent crises in Sudan and Ethiopia. There's a huge amount of diverse data sources that are pertinent to disasters, climate change, conflict, and migration in this region. But there has yet to be a consensus within and between the academic and programmatic communities on how best to leverage these data to understand and effectively prepare, anticipate, and respond. So thus, the objectives of this project were twofold. In essence, we wanted to apply a spatial analytical model to extract statistically significant information that would reveal unseen trends or would better quantify known trends identified utilizing the IOM's DTM flow monitoring registry data between 2018 and 2020. We sought to characterize the spatial temporal trends of migrating populations by asking questions such as how many people on average are on the move, and how does that change over time and space? How do the reasons for departure, such as economic reasons, conflict, disasters, change over time and space? And in addition to answering these questions, we also sought to evaluate the correlation between environmental variables, in this context, precipitation and temperature to be specific, and migration itself. We went on to juxtapose these outcomes with conflict and disaster data from open sources such as MDAT to lend a little bit of color to the trends that we identified. In alignment with our modus operandi at the Signal program, we undertook a user-centric design process that involved collaborators from the IOM Data Hub for the East and Horn of Africa from the inception of the project all the way through to its completion. So briefly, this regional data hub aims to enhance coordination, harmonize data collection, and foster a multi-layered analysis of mixed migration movements, trends, and characteristics across the region. So our priorities were rather closely aligned there. Our user-centric design process components are kind of outlined here, but what cannot be truly appreciated is the iterative nature of the work in which the priorities, questions, requirements, and insights of experts at the IOM really shaped and evolved the methodologies used and the subsequent spatial products. So as a brief overview before we get into the meat of our methods, I want to give you a kilometer high view. So IOM migration data and environmental data was spatially aggregated into admin1 polygons, and then depending upon the analysis, temporally aggregated. We utilized CRAF'd mapping, yearly change layers and cluster analysis, a spatial temporal clustering analysis to really characterize the IOM's data itself. And then subsequently, we went on to run geographically weighted regression models to interrogate the relationship between migration rates and environmental variables. So let's really dig into some of these data streams. The flow monitoring registry captures a wealth of data about migratory routes, the demographics of migrants, reasons for migration, modes of transportation, and vulnerabilities experienced by these populations. From the FMR, we included the respondents whose departing locations were in Somalia, Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Djibouti, and Yemen. Given that we were conducting analysis at the admin1 level, we only included entries for which we could determine the departure admin1 region, which led to the inclusion of about 97.2%. For this analysis, we chose to use open source data capturing precipitation and land surface temperature, as our background research revealed that these were the most frequently utilized variables that had been, frequently utilized variables in the exploration of the relationship between the environment and climate and migration. For our precipitation data, we used the CHIRPS dataset. This dataset captures rainfall estimates from both satellite data and rain gauges and is maintained by the United States Geological Survey and the Climate Hazards Center at the University of California in Santa Barbara. These data are reported on a 0.05 degree resolution, which is equivalent to approximately a 5-meter pixel. For this research, we chose to use their monthly data, which reflects total millimeters of rain per month. The land surface temperature data is collected by the Global Historical Climatological Network. This global data set captures mean monthly temperature at a 0.5 degree spatial resolution, which corresponds to approximately a 50 by 50 meter pixel. The processing of these data sets were identical to the processing of the FMR dataset in order to ensure parallel data formats. All of the layers were clipped to the study area and aggregated to the admin1 level. So for this work, we created and conducted 4 complementary and exploratory spatial analyses. First, we created CRAF'd maps that capture the average number of people migrating a day based upon the admin departure. And we do this for every season. This, as you see next, will give us a raw spatial characterization of migration rates across time and space. Then we created yearly change layers for each season. These change layers were utilized in a 2-step Moran's cluster analysis. First, the global Moran's I was applied to determine if there were any statistically significant large-scale spatial patterns. And then we went on to run the Anslian local Moran's I, which is used to identify clusters and outliers of increasing and decreasing migration. Next, a time series clustering analysis was done to identify regional clusters that had similar migration patterns over time for each primary reason of outmigration. So these analyses utilize monthly data from the FMR, disaggregating all respondents into the various reasons reported. So this is where we're really looking at outmigration secondary to secondary to economic reasons, or secondary to conflict, or secondary to natural disasters. Lastly, we ran multiple regression models to characterize the relationship between climate variables and migration rates. An ordinary least squares regression was done first as best practice to determine these relationships bereft of the spatial variable. And then we ran GWRs with the individual temperature and precipitation exploratory variables, and then in a joint model. So for our first output, we're showing you a chloroplast compilation of graphics that capture how many persons per day are departing their respective admin 1 locations. The polygons are representative of the admin areas, and in the legend, you can see that the number of people migrating per day is somewhere between 0 and just below 300 people. The larger numbers correspond to darker shades of red. As we iterate through the seasons, you can notice that the majority of migration originates from Ethiopia, but through time, there are higher numbers of people departing from within Somalia and Eritrea. Again, this is just kind of showing some of the raw data in a map format. This slide is a little busy, and I apologize. But this is demonstrating the outcomes of the Moran's Eye cluster and outlier analysis of the seasonal change layers by year. So to orient you a little bit to these maps, admin 1 polygons that are colored pink, these are considered clusters of increasing outmigration between the years. Whereas the light blue polygons, those are where we're seeing clusters of decreasing migration rates between the years. The red admin regions are outliers in which migration rates increased more than the surrounding neighbors, and the bright blue regions are the ones that had decreasing migration rates that were significantly different than its neighbors. So while there is a huge amount of information these maps do provide us, I'm only going to highlight a few patterns during this discussion in an effort to keep it brief. So for example, the first map, looking right up, I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, looking right up here, we are seeing a change in migration rates between January through March of 2019 versus 2018. We see statistically significant clusters of increased outmigration in the pink regions in Eritrea, northern Ethiopia, and the northern region of Somalia. Conversely, we're seeing clusters of decreased outmigration, these little blue guys, right, during this time period in the regions of Kenya and along the coast of the Indian Ocean. These patterns change when we look at a different season, April through June, which is just kind of in this right upper corner here. We see higher levels of outmigration in the southwestern admin 1 region of Kenya in 2019, and we see several communities that are identified as outliers along the Somalia and Kenya border, or the Somalia-Ethiopia borders, where outmigration has increased significantly more than its neighbors. So over time, we see an increase in clusters of increasing outmigration in Yemeni communities as well, which is explicitly evidenced by the July through September comparison between 2020 and 2019, which is in our lower map here down on the right-hand side. Lastly, and I think of particular interest, if you know the region, is the significant change in the status of the SNNP and Benishal Gumuz regions of Ethiopia between April through June and July through September, when we're looking at 2019 versus 2020. Both regions during the April through June season were part of a cluster that experienced a decrease in migration. However, during the July through September period, these administrative regions were identified as outliers of increasing levels of migration, along with, expectedly, Tigray. So here we're actually seeing the results of 2 different time series clustering analyses. These elucidate spatial temporal patterns regarding the reasons for migration between 2018 and 2020. On the left-hand side, you can see the analysis of outmigration cited to be secondary to natural disasters. And on the right, these are conflict-related outmigrations. So when looking at the natural disaster outcomes, we have 3 different clusters identified, each of which had similar trends. Excuse me. These groupings are generated when the migration values of the admin region increase or decrease around the same times and are approximately proportional. So for example, the temporal trend of the number of respondents who indicated that natural disaster was the main driver of migration was similar across most of Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somaliland, and parts of Yemen, as indicated in cluster 3. That's this green cluster right here. The graph below it here kind of shows how these trends vary over time. So as you can see, there was a substantial increase in the number of respondents who reported natural disasters as their reason for migration between April 2018 and January 2019 in this cluster. It also experienced the greatest degree of variation over time, but as a whole, we did see some decreasing rates. Now, similar to the natural disaster analysis, the number of respondents citing conflict as a cause for migration spiked around roughly the same time. Again, this is the map on the right, between March 2018 and March 2019. The admin regions included in this cluster, cluster 3 again, are quite similar to those when considering a natural disaster, but exclude Sudan, large parts of Eritrea, and include now most of Somalia. These communities, there's also an interestingly emergence of a new cluster, right? So we see Eastern Sudan and Northern Ethiopia kind of coming into this new orange cluster, our fourth cluster. These communities experienced an uptick in conflict-associated migration throughout 2019, but then we see this steep decline in February 2020, which is very likely secondary to COVID. So while I'm not going to spend any time going through this graphic, if you look on the right-hand side, the graphic just changed, and now we're looking at economically driven outmigration. I just wanted to show you that these trends, they vary pretty significantly in comparison to both natural disasters and conflict-oriented outmigration. All right, so now I'm going to pivot to looking at our geographically weighted regression model and how environmental variables correlate with these migration rates. I apologize for this table, I'm not going to belabor it, but really what we're saying here is that for all seasons, geographically weighted regression models outperformed ordinary least squares, OLS, when considering associations between precipitation and temperature as an explanatory variable for outmigration. So when utilizing OLS as a standard regression model that doesn't use spatial variables within its model, we actually see most, if not all, are showing us a negative adjusted R-squared, which indicates that the model itself actually fits worse than a simple horizontal line. At its best, the OLS performs no better than 3%. And every geographically weighted regression model performs at least 3.5 times better in explaining the relationship between the environmental variables and outmigration. And in several cases, the GWRs actually perform 10 times better than the OLS, which again doesn't use space as a variable. However, also as noted, within, you can kind of see what's highlighted is what performs best during that season. Which model we use is highly dependent on the season, right? The individual variables of temperature and precipitation did perform better than a joined model across the entire study period, but in some cases, temperature outperformed precipitation, and in other cases, vice versa. Now, this certainly could be explained by dry, rainy season variation, but these seasons really vary greatly across the study area and is deeply informed by topography. So digging into some of these GWR results, I present to you the outcome of the GWR comparing mean ground temperature with migration rates per day out of each administrative region for January through March across the study period. The upper maps, the colorful maps, these demonstrate the coefficients determined for temperature, with blue colors indicating an inverse relationship between migration rates and temperature, in which increases in temperature are associated with decreases in migration. And then the red colors indicate direct relationships between migration rates and temperature. So increases in temperature are associated with increases in migration rates. So here we kind of see that in the central and northwest region of the study area, the increase in temperature correlates to what we thought was an unexpected decrease in migration. Whereas in the southern kind of administrative districts, see down, I lost my pointer, down here. And then in other parts, like maybe Horn of Africa, certain parts of Yemen, there where we're seeing like this orange and red area, this is a positive correlation between temperature and outmigration. So again, as temperature increases, outmigration increases. These lower maps for your reference show the local R squared that are the accepted measure of fit of the model across time and space, with the darker administrative districts showing a better fit of the model. So in this slide, we're switching over to precipitation. We see that, so this, we're showing you this outcome because precipitation performed best as an explanatory variable for outmigration during the July through September season across the study period. So you're seeing the correlation between mean monthly precipitation and outmigration between 2018 and 2020. So again, our upper maps are demonstrating the coefficients determined for precipitation's association with migration rates, and blue colors are that inverse. So in this case, an increase in precipitation correlates with a decrease in migration, and red colors are the direct relationship. Increases in precipitation lead to increases of outmigration. So yet again, we do see that the environmental variables have largely inverse relationships with migration in the central area of the region, mostly in Somali Admin 1 region of Ethiopia. However, this makes more intuitive sense to us. So decreases in precipitation lead to increases in migration. So we're thinking about things like drought, et cetera. And in fact, in the 2020 season, almost the entirety of this study showed this correlation. However, in both 2018 and 2019, we do see some unexpected relationships. See here in red, where increases in precipitation actually led to increases in outmigration. And that was quite confounding for us until we started looking back at some of the other data and looking at some other explanatory data, like that open source data that we talked about, in which a lot of these communities were actually experiencing natural disasters, cyclones, et cetera. And so we think that the correlation between an increase in precipitation and an increase in outmigration was actually secondary to a natural disaster. So this, so again, in an effort to kind of explore some of the things that we're seeing here, we did utilize different open source disaster and conflict data, such as this from MDAT, and it really began to provide us with some valuable insights. We really need this additional context and color. So for example, the increase in disaster-related migration in mid-2018 kind of revealed in the time series clustering analysis coincides with these historic storms, such as Cyclone Sagar and several floods that affected parts of Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia in April and May of 2018. UN OCHA during this time reported flash floods, specifically in Somalia, Ethiopia, that really inundated approximately 50,000 households and displaced more than 30,000 people. And this trend is really reflected in the consistently high outmigration seen in our analysis in that region. The flooding experienced in 2018 across much of the region was preceded by a very prolonged drought in 2017 and 2018. It was considered a climate-related crisis that decimated much of the region's agricultural productivity. And this subsequently kind of cascaded into threatened livelihoods, increased malnutrition, and likely contributed to some communal violence. One specific ramification of these droughts was the significant loss of livestock experienced by Somali pastoralists. So as you can tell, like these historic narratives like really correlate with the trends of disaster and conflict-related outmigration, as can be seen in our analysis. So really briefly, because I know I'm running up upon time, some implications. I mean, we are seeing that all of this rich data and you know, if we really leverage spatial methods, we can come up with these statistically rigorous outcomes and insights that are unlikely to be identified without the spatial analytical trend. I mean, as expected, climate variables, conflict variables really influence migration in very complex ways across the region. And we believe that understanding the spatial temporal heterogeneity of these relationships is absolutely critical. Of course, there's limitations in data and really making sure that we recognize that these are associations and not causations. But I think some of the further research that I highly recommend and I'm very excited to engage in myself is really including multiple other variables into our geographically weighted regression models, things like conflict, topography, vegetation indices, and really kind of exploring a lot more of that contextual narrativization of what we find. So in conclusion, while these outcomes provide some statistically rigorous and spatially explicit information that are compelling, it does show that alternate explanatory variables such as conflict and economic stability really need to be incorporated to fully understand the drivers of migration. Notwithstanding the limitations of these analyses, hopefully these methods can be adopted and evolved to support humanitarian policy and programming. While we have presented, what we haven't presented was a post hoc analysis of these data. They were at this point quite old. We're really hoping that some of these methods can be taken up and utilized with near real-time data to help contemporary decision making. But there's certainly a lot more to be done to address that data to impact gap. Okay, so notwithstanding that, I am going to welcome your questions and inputs with regards to these methods in this data. I'm going to open up my chat and see if there's anything that we can talk about. Let's see, we've got one question. Oh, which software do we use to do spatial temporal analysis? Because we are a deeply privileged organization, we do have access to the Esri Arc Pro. We also have done some of our other analysis within R, which is more open source. There's a lot of different opportunities out there to engage with different types of software, but for this one, we ended up using Esri's products. Any other questions? I know this was really dense. It was really fast. I wanted to put out there, we do have a QR code that has a link to the complete report. This is the community facing report here. But if there's anything else, I'm very happy to share my contact information. I think we have about 3 more minutes. No. All right, I'm putting my contact information in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to us at the Atrocity Prevention Lab. We have a community of practice online on LinkedIn, and feel free to email me at any time. Thank you so much, everyone.